On the day of my coming-of-age ceremony, my two older brothers brought home a 7-year-old orphan girl. For the orphan girl, my eldest brother slapped me across the face. My second brother furiously shouted at me to get out, "Don't come back." I didn't say another word, picked up my luggage, and left. They thought I was just throwing a tantrum and would be back in a few days. Finally enjoying some peace, my two brothers took the orphan girl on an overseas trip to Norway to see the Northern Lights, my lifelong dream. Until many days later, when they returned to the country and suddenly learned that I had joined a decade-long closed medical research program. I could never go home again. That night, they completely broke down. The day I booked a one-way ticket happened to be Thanksgiving. My mentor saw me off at the research institute and softly reminded me, "You'll depart in 7 days. Anna, if there's anyone you can't let go of, remember to say a proper goodbye." Spring has come to North City, yet it remains bitterly cold. I've been standing by the street for a long time. Eventually, I took out my phone and called my second brother, Evan. After all, we've been siblings for over 20 years. No matter how strained things are now, we should at least have one last meal together. But the call was repeatedly declined, and in the end, the phone was turned off altogether. Steeling myself, I dialed my eldest brother Ethan instead. This time, after a long wait on the other end, they finally deigned to answer the call. Afraid they'd lose patience, I instinctively spoke faster. "It's Thanksgiving today. Could you come home for dinner together?" Remembering the housekeeper had taken leave to celebrate the holiday, I carefully added, "I'll cook tang yuan. With strawberry filling. Tiffany likes that." Tiffany is the orphan girl my two elder brothers adopted. The voice on the other end was indifferent and impatient. Thanks to you, Tiffany hasn't even been discharged from the hospital yet. How dare you still celebrate Thanksgiving? I pretended not to understand his disgust. Then I'll cook and bring it to the hospital for everyone to eat together. Is that all right? I never used to lower myself like this in the past. After Tiffany came, I argued with my two elder brothers for years. At the fiercest of times, I never willingly bowed my head. But this time, perhaps in parting, who knows when we'll meet again. Over there, no one responded to me. After a long while, it was Tiffany's soft, childish voice that broke the deadlock. "Big sister's strawberry-filled glutinous rice balls are delicious." I immediately replied, "Then I'll make them and bring them over." As soon as I spoke, afraid they might refuse again, I hastily ended the call. After hanging up, the wind made my eyes sting. I bought ingredients on the way home, hastily prepared the meal, packed it into containers, and rushed to the hospital. There was only one small dining table in the ward, and even squeezing in, it could barely fit 3 people sitting around it. Ethan looked up at me. Before he could say anything, I had already picked up a small bowl and voluntarily went to eat by the floor-to-ceiling window. Out of the corner of my eye, he seemed slightly startled. But it was only a fleeting moment of surprise. Soon, he continued busily serving Tiffany glutinous rice balls and handing her a spoon. The chairs in the hospital room were hard, so Evan took a pillow and placed it behind Tiffany's back. Tiffany was young and had a sweet tooth, stuffing herself with several strawberry-filled glutinous rice balls in a row. Eating too quickly, she let out a delicate cough. I couldn't help but glance sideways. I saw Evan immediately patting her back, while Ethan quickly stood up and poured her a glass of warm water. They pretended to scold with their words, "Eat slowly, who's going to take it from you?" A scene all too familiar. Only now, it was me sitting in the spot that once belonged to Tiffany. Lost in thought, I failed to avert my gaze. It wasn't until Ethan finished passing the water and, seemingly sensing my stare, that he looked up. The warm, concerned expression from a moment ago turned ice-cold the instant our eyes met. To be honest, it was quite hurtful. I hurriedly lowered my head, silently shoving the dumplings into my mouth. The filling choked my throat, and I couldn't stop coughing. Ethan remarked indifferently, "Should I pour you a glass of water too?" My chest suddenly clenched, and I forcibly swallowed the cough. Soon, the sound of their cheerful chatter filled my ears again. Tiffany happily continued with her mouth full. Last week in Chinese class, we learned about the Northern Lights. I heard you can see it in Norway during winter. When I grow up, I want to go see it too. Ethan patted her head lightly. Why wait until you grow up? It's no big deal. Let's go this year. Evan also chuckled softly. Well, both the eldest brother and I happen to have time off at the end of the year. We can take you then. Perhaps the box was too hot. My hands trembled slightly, nearly spilling the rice dumplings on the floor. They chatted enthusiastically, and within less than half an hour, they had even booked the tickets for their trip. Tiffany cheered with excitement, so thrilled that she practically threw herself into Ethan and Evan's arms. After a while, as if suddenly remembering I was still there, she tilted her head and asked me, "Sister, are you coming with us?" I remembered that I should also tell Ethan and Evan about my upcoming departure. Actually, no. In a few days, I'll be going on a long trip with Professor Richard. Ethan impatiently cut me off. There's no need to tell us about these things. The words that came to my lips, I may not return for a long time, were ultimately swallowed back with difficulty. Ethan suddenly remembered something and glanced at me indifferently. Tiffany wants to be discharged tomorrow. She was injured by you. It wouldn't be convenient for her to stay outside. I plan to have the housekeeper prepare a guest room. Before he could finish, I spoke softly. I'll vacate the master bedroom for her to stay. Ethan stopped mid-sentence. He seemed to think he had misheard. After staring at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with unconcealed disbelief. What? After a brief moment of stunned silence, Evan also frowned. Probably thinking I was speaking out of anger, his tone grew somewhat impatient. There's no need for this. We know you're petty. Once Tiffany recovers, she can move back outside. I looked at them seriously. Let her move in. She's young and needs someone to take care of her. It's troublesome for you all to keep running back and forth. Besides, I haven't stayed at home much these past few years. The master bedroom would suit her better. With a loud bang, Ethan tossed the takeout box onto the coffee table. The sudden noise made me pause mid-sentence. His expression darkened, likely still convinced I was putting on an act. Tiffany, now full, yawned and asked Ethan to read her a bedtime story. Evan cleared the dining table while Ethan helped Tiffany back into bed, picked up a storybook, and sat beside her to read. Same as countless times over these years, I once again became the awkward and superfluous one. I stood up and grabbed the bag from the chair. My throat ached slightly as I spoke. I'm leaving. No one responded. Evan wiped the dining table calmly, while Ethan softly read a storybook. I walked toward the hospital room door, passing by Ethan. His gaze remained fixed on the book, eyes lowered. I couldn't see his face clearly, couldn't discern his expression. As I walked out of the hospital room door, all I heard was his voice reading the last lines, and so, Snow White was driven out of her home. Suddenly, I remembered that many years ago, when our parents died abruptly in a fire. Ethan, his eyes bloodshot, held me tightly. Using the same gentle tone, he whispered to comfort me. Eldest brother and second brother are still here. With brothers around, Anna will always have a home. Liar. My nose inexplicably started aching terribly. I rushed back to school overnight, headed straight to the lab, and busied myself wrapping up an ongoing experiment. Only 7 days remained. Within this week, I needed to settle all my academic and personal matters in Beijing. I was busy almost all night. The next morning, I caught a quick nap before heading home. The master bedroom had to be vacated for Tiffany. The housekeeper helped me pack the guest room while grumbling angrily. What kind of arrangement is this, where the owner stays in the guest room and an outsider takes the master bedroom? As I packed books and clothes into my suitcase, I responded, it's fine. I won't be staying much longer anyway. Behind me, a chilling voice suddenly rang out, where do you think you're going? I turned around. Ethan was standing behind me, though I had no idea when he had arrived. His expression was ice cold, his gaze fixed on my freshly packed suitcase. Evan leaned against the bedroom door, also staring at me, his face equally frigid. Tiffany, who had followed inside, was secretly eyeing my suitcase. Being young after all, the faint anticipation in her eyes couldn't be concealed. For a moment, I wanted to tell the truth. Yet I remembered Ethan's impatient words, "No need to tell us about these things." Suddenly, I didn't dare speak up anymore. At least this way, when the day came for me to leave, I could still delude myself with false comfort. They just didn't know, not that they didn't care. My hands slipped into my coat pockets, knuckles clenched until they ached. I feigned nonchalance as I said, "It's just moving things to change rooms." We agreed the master bedroom would go to Tiffany. Ethan's expression softened slightly, only to darken again as he said sharply, "Tiffany won't be staying here. You pushed her down the stairs just days ago. Do you really think we'd feel safe letting you live under the same roof as her?" I instinctively responded, "Then I'll move to live at school." Ethan's expression, which had just softened slightly, darkened completely. I really didn't mean to provoke him. It's just that before leaving, I didn't want to cause them any more trouble. Tiffany looked innocent. "This is your room, sister, I can't take it." I said calmly, "Don't worry. Once I move out, I won't be coming back." Tiffany couldn't help but immediately curl her lips into a smile. Realizing her impropriety, she quickly lowered her head in guilt. Ethan shouted angrily, "Who are you threatening?" Evan also sneered, "Leave if you want to." "Who's begging you to stay?" I said nothing more and continued packing. After living in this home for over 20 years, there were simply too many belongings left behind. I couldn't possibly take everything, only packing some essentials and the belongings my parents had left me. I stuffed 2 suitcases full and pushed them out the door. Ethan's enraged voice rang in my ears, "If you've got the guts, then never come back." Struggling, I dragged my suitcases downstairs and stepped out through the front door. Behind me, Ethan's voice was laced with anger and sarcasm. "We've been through so many years of this. It's about time everyone gets some peace. Don't come crawling back home if you can't last 3 days." I originally wanted to find an umbrella. But hearing those words, my throat tightened, and I stepped straight into the torrential rain. The downpour was too heavy. Within moments, I was drenched from head to toe. As I walked out of the front yard, the rain blurred my vision. Ethan's raised voice still followed behind me, "From now on, anyone who dares to open the door for her can leave with her." Eyes glued shut, I couldn't tell, was it rain or tears? Through soaked clothes, crimson began seeping at the cuffs. It was probably from carrying the luggage downstairs earlier. The barely healed wound on my arm had been torn open again. I didn't feel any pain, just numbness enveloping my body as I dragged my suitcase out of the gated community. At this hour, I wonder if the school dormitory has closed its doors. Honestly, I don't even know where I'm heading. Tiffany chased after her, her exaggerated voice choked with sobs, "Sister, sister." Then came Ethan's urgent voice of protest, "Don't you know your own health condition? What if you catch a cold from the rain?" For a second, I even thought he was calling me. In that fleeting moment of confusion, I barely caught the rest of his words. "Evan, have the nanny make ginger tea for Tiffany." I tried to smile, but the expression faltered on my lips. Maybe it was because I had barely slept the night before and had rushed over early this morning to pack my things. Now, drenched from the heavy rain, darkness blurred my vision. Just as I was about to collapse, a strong hand suddenly steadied me. At the same time, the rain pouring down over me abruptly vanished. With effort, I raised my gaze and, after a long moment, recognized Daniel, a senior in my department. His car stood idling in the downpour. Without a word, he took my luggage and stowed it in the trunk. Ethan sneered behind me, leaving so decisively, "Turns out you've found such a powerful backer." Perhaps he had deliberately followed to witness my wretched state. Daniel looked at my disheveled appearance and angrily defended me. "What's the point of acknowledging brothers like these? Anyway, you'll be leaving in a few days." I frantically cut him off with a panicked voice, "Daniel." Daniel finally fell silent. He yanked open the car door and forcefully shoved me inside. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ethan's face darken instantly. "Daniel, what exactly do you mean by this?" Daniel sneered with undisguised disgust. What do I mean? You'll find out soon enough. My heart instantly leaped to my throat. Ethan stood frozen in place, as if unable to process what had just happened. A long moment later, as the car was about to leave, he finally rushed forward to pull open my door. But Daniel had already gotten in and swiftly locked the car. Through the rain-streaked window, I could barely make out Ethan's lips forming the words, "Anna, get out of the car." His expression was furious, yet strangely mingled with some other indescribable emotion. I don't understand, I only know that by now, my departure likely means nothing to him. Neither to him nor to Evan. I close my eyes and stop looking at him. As the car drives away, Ethan remains standing there for a long time in the rearview mirror. Daniel is still angrily scolding. He kicked you out in heavy rain despite your injury. I really don't get why you'd come back to suffer this humiliation. I glanced sideways at the torrential rain outside the car window. After a long silence, I spoke softly. Before, they were very good to me. Daniel didn't believe it. I only met him in college. He had never seen Ethan or Evan treat me kindly. A mist rose in my eyes as I earnestly repeated, word by word, it's true. Before, they were very good to me. From the time I can remember, my parents were rarely home. They had devoted almost their entire lives to drug research and medical experiments. I would often be away from home for a year or two at a time. From childhood, aside from the paid nannies, my caretakers were my two brothers, 8 years older than me. When I was 6 years old and had just started elementary school, the teacher announced a parent-teacher meeting for new students. Both my parents were thousands of miles away. I rushed home in tears and hid under the covers in distress. 14-year-old Ethan came into my bedroom late at night to check if I had kicked off the blanket. When he pulled back the covers, he saw my tear-streaked face. He held me, imitating our mother's manner, wiping away my tears. Then he patted my back and comforted me, saying, "It's all right, Big Brother will go be Anna's guardian. Mom and Dad are busy, but Big Brother will never be too busy." The next day, he skipped class to attend my parent-teacher meeting and got scolded by my teacher for being reckless. Rushing back to middle school, I was called out by the homeroom teacher to stand under the national flag as punishment for the entire afternoon. I didn't wait for him to pick me up after school, and when I ran to his school next door to find him, he was still standing on the flag platform. The sun was scorching, and I was worried he might get sunburned, my eyes reddening with anxiety. He came running down from the stage, grinning as he tried to reassure me, "What's the big deal? The sun is warm, my brother loves basking in the sunlight." We ate at a roadside stall and walked home under the moonlight. When we arrived, the nanny had taken leave for personal reasons and was gone. Evan had already prepared steaming hot meals. Opening the door, the aroma filled the entire house. Evan was in the kitchen fetching bowls and chopsticks, peeking out as he said, "Wash your hands and eat." Since childhood, Evan had been quiet in nature, yet gentle and considerate. He would silently roll up my sleeve when I came home stealthily, not daring to admit I'd gotten a scratch on my arm from playing too wildly, then clean it with iodine and bandage it up. When he finished, he would look up, about to say something. But seeing me biting my lips nervously and guiltily, he would just let out a soft sigh. He would reach out, pat my head, and say, "Be more careful next time." I was mischievous and restless as a child, never learning to behave. Yet he would patiently bandage me up time after time. Time and again, in my panicked gaze, they would sigh and say, "Be more obedient next time." For many years when our parents were often absent, they were both brothers and father figures to me as I grew up. Until the year I turned 12, when I saw the aurora on television. Ethan promised to take me to see it during the new year, and Evan booked plane tickets for all three of us. The next day, my parents suddenly passed away. Before the incident, they had been developing a cardiac medication, on the verge of success and preparing to release it at a low price. The exposed news provoked hostility from pharmaceutical companies. The arsonist set fire to the research lab in the early hours. The day of the accident was Thanksgiving. To ensure heart patients could receive the affordable new drug before Thanksgiving, my parents worked through the night in the lab. When Ethan, Evan, and I got the news and rushed over, all we saw were two charred bodies. That was my last memory of my parents. Even to this day, I still struggle to recall what their faces should have looked like. Along with them, perishing in the fire was one of my parents' students, barely in their 20s. She was a newlywed woman when the accident happened, her child not even a year old, and her husband already deceased. Her charred remains were found with her hand still tightly clutching the longevity locket engraved with her daughter's name. Ethan and Evan spent 6 arduous years searching, finally locating the child in an orphanage. Fate works in strange ways. 7-year-old Tiffany had been living with my family for half a year when. That evening, I went to a street food stall with my classmates and happened to run into the director of the orphanage, who, under the influence of alcohol, accidentally spilled the truth while crying bitterly. I learned that the real Tiffany had actually passed away at the orphanage at the age of 3 due to a heart condition. The Tiffany who was pushed onto us was an orphan suffering from liver failure, unable to afford treatment. Out of pity, the director replaced the deceased Tiffany with her, allowing my brother to provide her with medical care. I rushed home just in time to witness Tiffany breaking my things yet again. It was a family photo of the 5 of us when our parents were still alive. The frame lay shattered on the floor, its glass splintered. As she had done countless times before, Tiffany crouched to pick it up, then held out her scratched hand, playing the victim and demanding Ethan's comfort. Furious, I stepped forward and shoved her away, losing control and shouting without thinking, "Get out of here!" Ethan darkened his face at me for the first time. Even Evan, who had always been gentle and soft-spoken, showed an expression of disappointment. "Anna, enough with your arrogance and domineering." I repeated every word I had heard, then saw Tiffany's flustered expression. I thought that at least her illness had been cured. An imposter shouldn't keep occupying my home and brothers. You shouldn't have ruined my things countless times. But what responded to me was Ethan's scolding voice. "Anna, can't you tolerate Tiffany at all? She is the only flesh and blood left by the student our parents valued most during their lifetime. How does your conscience not ache when fabricating these words?" After that, peace never existed between us again. A month ago, Tiffany pulled the same trick again, breaking the medical research trophy I had just received. I chased her to the stairwell and, overcome with emotion, slapped her. She deliberately threw herself down the stairs. I tried to grab her but ended up falling down alongside her. My arm was injured in the fall. Struggling to get up, before I could even say a word, Ethan slapped me across the face for the first time. The usually gentle and taciturn Evan suddenly erupted in fury. "Anna, get out if you can't stay here." They took Tiffany to the hospital, leaving behind me, equally injured. The Aurora we promised to watch together now, 10 years later, became their trip with Tiffany. I snapped out of memories. Daniel, driving next to me, handed over a tissue. I froze for a moment before belatedly realizing my eyes had already grown moist. When I agreed to my mentor's request to join the decade-long sealed research project, I thought I had already come to terms with everything. Only now do I realize, recalling those bygone days can still make tears uncontrollably well up in my eyes. It's alright, it's alright. People always need a little more time to fade memories and let things go. I returned to school, moved into the dorm, and continued working on my nearly completed thesis. The next day, when Daniel and I went to the library, we ran into Ethan and Evan again. They had Tiffany with them, probably on a whim, wanting to check out the university library for a change. Ethan was now a research institute advisor, and at just 30, he was already an associate professor. It wasn't strange for him to visit the library. I pretended not to see them, found a seat, opened my laptop, and continued working on my thesis. Tiffany, however, pulled them over to sit not far from me. From time to time, I could hear the girl's soft laughter beside me. Ethan seemed somewhat awkward and tried to stop her a few times, but she just kept chattering away. Evan gently reminded her, "Be good." Suddenly, I remembered what Evan used to sigh and say to me when I was little, "You have to be good next time." I finished up the paper in my hands and clicked save. Feeling somewhat out of breath, I stood up and went out for some water. When I returned to compose myself and went back in, my computer was already in Tiffany's hands. Ethan and Evan got up to fetch books from the shelves. Tiffany was alone, holding my computer, navigating and clicking effortlessly with the mouse. Alarm bells rang in my head, and I immediately snatched the computer back from her hands. She immediately dramatically fell to the ground, hitting her forehead against the seat, screaming and crying out in pain. Students reading in the library turned their gazes toward the commotion. With trembling hands, I retrieved my thesis from the recycle bin. When I reopened it, the entire document, filled with months of my hard work, text, and charts, was completely gone. All that remained was a smiley face made of symbols. That grotesque, grinning face leered back at me. My mind was buzzing. Then came Ethan, who had rushed over upon hearing the noise, asking without any explanation. "Anna, why did you push Tiffany?" Evan helped Tiffany up, his face showing anger. More and more people gathered around. Daniel was picking up books by the shelf but hurried over upon hearing the commotion. He looked at my computer screen, then at my expression, quickly understanding something. "Your thesis was deleted?" Ethan's furious expression froze momentarily as he walked over and looked at my computer. After a long silence, he frowned. "That's impossible, Tiffany." "Let's go." I didn't let him finish, calmly turning to look at Daniel. "How strange." I should have been furious, should have lost control like countless times before, yelling at Tiffany, even getting physical. Then losing my temper completely and having a huge fight with Ethan and Evan over their indulgence and partiality toward Tiffany. But at this moment, I just wanted to leave. I'd been arguing with them for 4 years. Countless times over those 4 years, every single time ended the same way. Now, I don't want to argue anymore. Anyway, there are only a few days left before I leave. I carried my laptop and walked out of the library. Behind me, Ethan chased after me. I heard his voice, as indifferent as usual, yet with a hint of unease. "I'm in charge of this thesis. I'll give you an extra week." I replied lightly, "No need. I don't have another week." I walked toward the end of the hallway. Ethan must have suddenly lost his mind. Someone who hadn't wanted to say a word to me in years suddenly caught up and grabbed my arm. "Anna, what's wrong with you lately?" His voice seemed to carry a hint of unease. But I didn't look back. I just reached out and gently pushed his hand away. As I stepped into the elevator, Evan followed and blocked the door. He glanced at the computer in my hand, his tone awkward. "Give me the laptop. I'll have some free time in a few days and we'll figure out how to restore it for you." He studied computer science and now runs a tech company. Something gently tugged at my heart. In these past few years, since Tiffany arrived, it was actually Ethan who argued with me more often or got angry and criticized me. Evan was taciturn and naturally gentle, so we didn't have many conflicts. I remained silent for a long while, locking eyes with him. Until he spoke again. "Tiffany is still young. Even if she did delete it, it probably wasn't intentional." So, he was afraid I'd resent Tiffany and, in a fit of rage, push her down the stairs again? I thought, for once, he might finally stand by my side. I twisted my lips, feeling ridiculous for even hoping. Reaching out, I pressed the elevator's close button. The heart that was once always discontent has now gradually calmed, eventually becoming still water without ripples. It seems I no longer feel sad either. As the elevator doors closed, I softly said, "It's fine, no need." Evan frantically reached out, perhaps still trying to stop the closing doors, but in the end, it was too late. In the last glimpse, I seemed to see panic and helplessness rising in his eyes. The fleeting scene passed by before the elevator doors completely closed. It must have just been my imagination. The next day, after finishing up my school affairs, I gave my luggage one final check. At noon, I treated my roommates to a meal as a farewell. Just as we left the restaurant, Evan suddenly called. I answered, but he remained silent for a while. I thought he must have accidentally dialed my number. He finally spoke just as I was about to hang up. When are you coming home? I paused, unable to shake the suspicion that he might have meant to call Tiffany instead. Still, I replied, school's been busy lately, so I won't be back. Evan persisted, what about tonight? I couldn't fathom his sudden interest. But I made up a quick excuse, I've already made plans with classmates. There was another long silence on the other end. After a while, they spoke again awkwardly, today is your eldest brother's and my birthday. I was momentarily speechless. Over the years, it had almost always been me alone planning their birthdays. Buying cakes, booking venues, and selecting gifts more than a month in advance. Ethan is busy with his students, and Evan is occupied with work, naturally not one for revelry. Every time it was me who prepared everything, then dragged them into celebrating, forcing them to put on surprised expressions. But this year, I truly forgot. I didn't know what to say, and after a long silence, all I could mutter was, sorry. A word that was stiff and formal. The silence lingered. When Evan spoke again, his voice was slightly hoarse, come back for dinner. I'll cook. I don't really want to go. He continued, the nanny took Tiffany to evening tutoring. The biting wind on the roadside stung my face. Eventually, I responded, all right. This time, it really should be the last meal together. When I got home, Evan was cooking in the kitchen. As dusk fell, Ethan stood smoking by the wrought iron gate in the front yard. In the freezing cold, under the streetlight, I noticed his already pale complexion had turned slightly bluish from the chill. For a moment, I even felt like he was waiting for me. As I approached, he was probably choking on the smoke and coughed twice. Nowadays, I really have nothing to say to him. So, grasping at straws, I remarked, you could smoke a little less. Ethan didn't say a word but immediately stubbed out the cigarette in his hand. I paused, genuinely surprised that he'd listen to me. When I entered, Evan was holding dishes and chopsticks and poked his head out from the kitchen, saying, wash your hands, and let's eat. My eyes suddenly reddened. At the dinner table, Ethan brought up the trip to Norway to see the Northern Lights. We booked an extra ticket since you'll be on holiday during that time. You should come along. My hand, holding the chopsticks, froze midair. Evan peeled a few shrimp for me and placed them in my bowl. He then spoke in a gentle tone, we promised you a long time ago. But your eldest brother and I have been busy with work, as you know. I lowered my head, tears almost spilling. After all these years, they still remembered. I muttered, this Saturday I have to go out of town with Professor Richard. Probably won't make it back. Evan kept peeling shrimp for me, the grease staining his fair, slender fingers. He replied, then go before Saturday and come back early. In our country, you can see the aurora if you go further north. I wanted to voice my refusal, yet the words remained unspoken. In the end, it seemed there was still a faint glimmer of lingering hope in my heart. After all these years, I just can't seem to forget that night. That night, Ethan and Evan had booked the tickets, promising to take me to see the Northern Lights. That night, our parents were still alive, Tiffany hadn't moved in yet, and my brothers still treated me well. That night marked the final evening of happiness and smooth sailing in my 12 years. I could never forget that promise, though it wasn't really about wanting to go to Norway or see the Northern Lights. I just missed the days when I was still doted on by my parents and brothers. As Evan spoke, he wiped his hands and took out his phone, changing the booking to a flight to Mo the next day. After booking the tickets, he hesitated before reaching out and patting my back. Anna, after all, Tiffany is just an outsider. Your brothers will always be your brothers. My eyes were filled with mist, and my hands trembled uncontrollably. I didn't even dare lift my head. After many years, we had a meal together peacefully and harmoniously. For a moment I even felt that Tiffany's 4 years living here were just an illusion of mine. It wasn't until the meal was almost finished that Ethan suddenly changed the subject. But people outside have all sorts of ulterior motives. For example, Daniel, you should understand what he's after by approaching you. Don't get too close to him anymore. I looked up in astonishment. Ethan continued in a low voice, the medical research Mom and Dad interrupted back then will soon be restarted. You must have heard something about it. The list of participants for this study was reviewed by me, and Daniel's name is on it. Perhaps he wants to bring you along to extract the research results our parents lost in the fire from you, so he can claim them for himself. I couldn't listen any longer and stood up, leaving my bowl and chopsticks behind. Daniel isn't as despicable as you think. Ethan's feigned warmth on his face quickly turned into a frown. Anna, what kind of attitude is that? I'm your eldest brother. Would I harm you? Evan stood up and patted me, but his words carried the same meaning. Once that closed-door research begins, no one can say for sure how many years it will take. Daniel probably only joined to obtain medical achievements. Once he gets what he wants, he could find an excuse to leave at any time. If you get pulled in by him, the consequences would be unimaginable. Anna, think about Mom and Dad back then. Daniel is still an outsider, after all. Your big brother is doing this for your own good. The small ripple of emotion in my heart completely froze over again. So this was the real reason they called me back. Without another moment's hesitation, I reached out and pushed Evan's hand away. When I spoke, all that remained in my eyes was complete indifference. Daniel has even settled his family members, there's no way he would flee halfway. Even if he really wanted me to participate, it would only be because he values me. Someone in this world must make sacrifices and, just like our parents did, like so many senior colleagues and predecessors have. What does it really mean when we say, the consequences would be unthinkable? Ethan's face darkened completely. Isn't this just to protect Daniel? Anna, don't give me that self-righteous act. I could bear it no longer. I grabbed my phone and walked out the door. Furious, Ethan swept the dishes off the table. The sound of shattering porcelain was sharp and jarring. I didn't linger. Outside the villa, I hailed a taxi and left. Unsurprisingly, the next morning, Evan called. He seemed hesitant to speak. Tiffany doesn't want to stay in the country and still wants to go to Norway. So. Just then, a message from Daniel popped up on my phone. I need to go there first, leaving at noon to prepare for the new research institute. We'll see each other again when you arrive on Saturday. I glanced at the message on my phone. Meanwhile, Evan's voice continued, sounding unusually apologetic. After you finish with Professor Richard and come back, early next year, your eldest brother and I will take you again. I replied softly, Evan fell silent for a long moment before suddenly asking me, Anna, have you been all right lately? What an odd question. He had seen me nearly every day during this time. Outside the window, snow began to fall. The first snow of the year in North City seemed to arrive later than usual. I replied, it's good. The call lingered without being hung up. I heard Evan speak again, will you come home tonight? Ethan's somewhat stiff voice came through along with the others, Auntie is back, and there's sticky rice lotus root for dinner. That's what 12-year-old Anna liked to eat. But now I'm 22 and have long outgrown my sweet tooth. I pursed my lips, I won't be going back tonight. And not ever again. Suddenly, Tiffany's exclamation rang out from over there. Followed immediately by Ethan's tense voice, I told you not to go into the kitchen, let me see where you got burned. The call ended abruptly. I listened to the beep 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 tone, and after a long silence, the phone screen went dark. Everything fell into complete stillness. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the swirling snow outside. Take out my phone again and reply to Daniel's message, together. Grab the already packed suitcase and book the nearest flight. I leave the school and take a taxi to the airport. As the plane climbs to an altitude of 10,000 meters, everything in North City gradually disappears from view. The day I officially prepare to enter the Confidential Research Institute is the third day after my arrival in South City. Director Marcus from the Research Institute took us out for lunch together at noon. After several rounds of drinks, everyone was quite tipsy. By the end, many of those seated around the table had reddened eyes. Director Marcus allowed us to make one final call to our loved ones, then solemnly said, If you're afraid or reluctant, it's not too late to back out now. People around me started taking out their phones to make calls, and then occasional muffled sobs could be heard. After sitting in silence for a long time, I finally took out my phone and opened WeChat. A red dot appeared on Moments. I clicked it and saw Ethan had posted an update. They had already arrived in Norway with Tiffany. In the photo, the sky is awash with dazzling fluorescence of various colors, like a giant overturned palette. The aurora lights up the snowy night as bright as day. Tiffany, bundled up in a thick white down jacket and tightly wrapped in a bright red scarf, turns back with a smile that crinkles her eyes amidst the boundless snowfield. That bright red scarf was knitted for me by Evan himself when I was 10 years old. Later, when Tiffany first came to Beijing, she said she couldn't get used to the cold weather there. Evan told me to give the scarf to Tiffany, promising he'd give me a bigger one next time. Now, 4 years have passed, and he's never mentioned giving me another one again. Director Marcus's voice beside me interrupted my thoughts. Anna, make a call. It might be many years before we get another chance like this. I clutched my phone tightly, my knuckles turning white. After a long pause, I finally dialed the number. But what came through was Tiffany's cheerful voice. Sis, what's up? I croaked out, where are they? Tiffany answered brightly, you mean your brothers? They told me to answer the call, said they don't have time. If there's anything, just tell me. Ethan's raised voice came from the other end, turn off the phone and come here. Tiffany's voice carried a hint of laughter, pretending to be innocent, but at her young age, unable to hide the provocation and smugness. Sis, what exactly is the matter? I can help pass on the message for you. My heart gradually calmed, finally feeling free from lingering thoughts. I replied flatly, nothing. Reaching out, I ended the call. After everyone finished their calls and had their meal, they began entering the research institute. A single door separated them, completely cutting off the outside world. I removed the SIM card, snapped it in half, and tossed it into the trash bin. Stepping through the door, I didn't look back. After just 1 week in Norway, Ethan proposed returning to their home country. As Thanksgiving approached, Tiffany insisted on staying to celebrate the holiday before going back, saying there was an event that day. Ethan instinctively wanted to refuse. Although school was already on break, he had no work to attend to this year. Yet for some inexplicable reason, he felt that something was missing from this trip abroad. It felt like an eternity, though only 7 days had passed. He was thinking of what excuse he could use to go back. Before he could come up with one, Evan spoke softly beside him. If you had fun, you can come again next time. I still have work at the company and shouldn't delay any longer. Tiffany, still caught up in the excitement, retorted with displeasure. You were the one who just told Anna a while ago that you wouldn't go to the company during the holidays. Evan fell silent, seemingly guilty, as he averted his gaze to the window. After a long pause, he finally frowned, somewhat deliberately changing the subject. I've told you many times, don't call her Anna. You should call her sister. Tiffany curled her lips in disdain, tossed aside the newly bought doll, and ran out. Ethan glanced at the teddy bear left lying on the floor. Suddenly, for some reason, I remembered Anna from childhood, her favorite style. What was Anna like as a child? Ethan struggled to recall but found he couldn't quite remember. All that came to mind was Anna crying and screaming, demanding that Tiffany get out. Then there was Anna as an adult, growing more and more silent and withdrawn. She no longer liked talking to him and Evan, always saying she was busy with school and rarely came home. Occasionally, Tiffany would break her things. After losing her temper, she managed to compose herself again and said calmly and indifferently, let it be. She was becoming increasingly fond of boarding at school. Ethan occasionally bumped into her on campus. One moment she was joking with her classmates, the next, upon meeting his gaze, her expression instantly grew quiet and uneasy. Ethan picked up the doll from the ground. Suddenly, he realized that he seemed to have lost something. When had it started to go missing? That willful and coquettish Anna, since when had she disappeared? Evan's somewhat distant voice interrupted his thoughts. I'm returning home tonight. Since Tiffany wants to keep playing, you can stay and entertain her. Ethan suddenly looked up, seeing a faint trace of unease in Evan's eyes, the same unease that echoed in his own heart. Almost instinctively and urgently, Ethan spoke up, I'm also returning home tonight. Evan said nothing more, silently beginning to pack his own belongings. They landed in North City by evening the next day. On the way back, Ethan couldn't shake the unsettling twitch in his brow, throbbing relentlessly for some inexplicable reason. When I got home, Anna was nowhere to be seen. The nanny came out to greet me. He handed over his coat and casually asked, hasn't Anna come back yet? The nanny shook her head. Miss hasn't returned. Ethan frowned. It's been over a week already. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving, how could she still not be back? The nanny had stayed in the household for many years and, in her heart, felt sorry for Anna. Her tone couldn't help but turn cold. I don't know. Ethan was about to ask something else. Tiffany impatiently rolled her eyes discreetly, clinging to his arm and coquettishly pleaded. He'll always come back. Big brother, don't worry about those things. Go look at the new storybook I bought first. You'll read it to me tonight. Ethan suddenly felt impatient. Recalling how Tiffany had casually dismissed Anna by name when they were in Norway, her tone dripping with disdain. Now, regarding Anna's absence for several days, she clearly couldn't care less. How much sincerity was there really behind her constant calls of sister? The nanny turned back into the kitchen and muttered softly, the master doesn't care about the young mistress anymore anyway, so why bother asking? Those words, like an invisible thorn, abruptly pricked Ethan's heart. Tiffany muttered unhappily, he's a grown-up, it's not like he'll get lost. For some reason, Ethan's temper flared up suddenly. He jerked away from the hand clutching at him and, with a cold expression, went straight upstairs. Behind him, Tiffany wailed in a tearful shriek. Big brother, did I say something wrong? Aren't you going to read me a story anymore? Ethan didn't turn his head, only saying coldly, 6th grade already and still can't read? Tiffany's pitiful sobs began. In the past, Ethan would have immediately turned around to comfort her. When she cried, no matter what request she made, he would always comply. He always believed that treating Tiffany poorly would mean failing his parents and betraying the trust of the student they had valued most. But 4 years, 4 whole years. He had been utterly devoted to Tiffany, showering her with endless care and attention. He believed he had lived up to the memory of the student who perished in the fire alongside their parents. But what about Anna, his own flesh and blood? Ethan walked upstairs and stood once again in front of Anna's bedroom. He pushed open the door to find it utterly empty. Stepping inside and looking around, he realized with a shock, she had taken so much with her. A sudden uneasiness welled up in his heart. Like invisible, fine vines, they slowly crept up his neck, making it hard for him to breathe. He sat down on the sofa, opened his phone, and flipped through it repeatedly. There was no missed call or text from Anna. There were no updates on social media either. Nothing at all. Why hasn't she come home yet? He flipped through his contacts back and forth, and in the end, he couldn't resist calling Anna's advisor, Professor Richard. The call was quickly answered, and the composed voice of the middle-aged professor came through. Ethan beat around the bush, talking in circles for a long time. Finally, he awkwardly asked, Anna hasn't been causing you any trouble these past few days, has she? Professor Richard sounded surprised on the other end. Anna? How could she possibly cause me any trouble? For some reason, Ethan's temple suddenly began to throb. Didn't she go with you on that out-of-town business trip? She hasn't returned yet, right? There was a long silence on the other end before the voice lowered, laced with unmasked sorrow. Ethan, what kind of joke is this? I did send Anna over, but how could she possibly come back with me? Ethan's phone suddenly slipped from his grip and fell to the ground. On the screen, the call duration timer continued to tick away. The bedroom fell into a silence so profound one could hear a pin drop. He felt as though he must have misheard something just now. What do you mean, how could Anna possibly come back? Breathing grew rapid, the sound of my heartbeat pounding deafeningly in my ears. It felt like a string in my mind was suddenly stretched to its limit, as if it might snap at any moment. Ethan's mind went blank for a moment before he slowly picked up his phone again. I don't think I quite understood. What did you just say? The voice on the other end grew increasingly distant in his ears. The thread in his mind finally snapped abruptly. Others might not understand. But Ethan, how could you not understand? If you hadn't withdrawn at the last minute, Anna wouldn't have gotten that spot. I heard from Anna that you withdrew for that girl named Tiffany. Ethan's face turned completely pale. On such a cold winter day, cold sweat beaded on his forehead. It felt as though he had never experienced such overwhelming fear before. Fumbling like a hot potato, he scrambled to hang up the phone. But somehow, I just couldn't muster any strength. The words I had heard began to replay in my mind like a curse. Others might not understand, but surely you do. Wasn't it because you withdrew at the last minute that a spot opened up for Tiffany? No, no. His name was originally on that list of participants. He made the last-minute decision to withdraw because, in the end, he couldn't bear to part with Anna. With their parents gone, he was afraid that if he left, Evan wouldn't take proper care of his Anna. As Anna had said, someone in this world must step forward to dedicate and sacrifice themselves, just like their parents did. So he had resolved himself with great determination. But as the departure time drew near, he ultimately couldn't let go of that personal attachment. He simply couldn't bring himself to leave. It's not because of Tiffany. How could it possibly be because of Tiffany? Anna actually thought he did it for Tiffany? So, was this why she chose to go in his place? How could that be? How could she? Large beads of cold sweat dripped from his forehead. His body felt as if it were burning in flames, yet also falling into a frozen abyss. Ethan gasped desperately for air but still felt himself rapidly nearing suffocation. Impossible, impossible. Over there, Professor Richard's voice sounded puzzled. Ethan, you can't possibly not know. Anna called you one last time before entering the research institute. In the midst of immense fear, despair, and confusion, Ethan forcibly pulled back a shred of rationality. He instinctively retorted, no, she didn't contact me. That's right, at least 20 years of being siblings. Even if they'd grown distant now, no matter how much resentment she holds in her heart. Before her 10 years of secluded research, she should have at least said goodbye to him. So, she must not have gone to attend. Professor Richard said firmly. That's impossible. At that time in the private room, when I stood up, I saw with my own eyes, she dialed your number. It was, last Saturday at noon. Ethan instinctively wanted to deny it again. But in a split second, something suddenly occurred to him. Last Saturday, around noon. At that time it was probably 5 a.m. in Norway. That day, at 5 in the morning, he had just taken Tiffany to see the Northern Lights. Tiffany insisted on taking numerous photos and excitedly played until nearly dawn before returning to the hotel. On the way back, Tiffany took his phone, saying she wanted to look at the photos. She walked while browsing, and in the blink of an eye, she was left behind by him. Ethan paused and turned around, seeing her press the phone to her ear. She was probably listening to the sound of the videos they had recorded. He impatiently called out to her, turn off the phone and come here. A terrible premonition surged like a tidal wave, instantly drowning his mouth and nose. So, back then, was Tiffany really looking at the photos and videos she took? The call had already ended at some point. The bedroom door he had closed was suddenly shoved open with force. Ethan sharply raised his gaze, for the first time desperately hoping it was Anna who had returned. Just like countless times before, she returned late at night from school. It didn't matter if she ignored him, if she kept a cold face, or if she caused trouble. He could forgive her, for trying to drive Tiffany away, for pushing Tiffany down the stairs. Suddenly, he felt everything else could be let go. As long as she came back, just let her come back. But when the bedroom door opened, it was Evan who rushed in, his eyes red and his whole body radiating coldness. His head and clothes were covered in snow, as if he had hurried back from some unknown place. After landing in Beijing, he immediately took a taxi and left without going home with Ethan and Tiffany. Ethan had no idea where he had gone. The usually gentle and composed man now had a dark expression, not even bothering to greet anyone. He walked straight into the walk-in closet, then the bathroom, before exiting and moving on to other bedrooms and the study. Ethan knew what he was looking for. Sitting on the bed, Ethan didn't even have the strength to stand up. Evan quickly finished searching both upstairs and downstairs before returning. He stopped in front of Ethan, who noticed his deathly pale and ashen face. When he spoke, Evan's face and voice trembled. "Anna is missing, she's gone." Ethan opened his mouth, but it took a while before he could make a sound. As if comforting himself, he repeated what Tiffany had said. She'll come back eventually. Such a grown person wouldn't just disappear." Evan's eyes turned bloodshot, his gaze misty with unshed tears. He reached out, his hand shaking uncontrollably, and suddenly grabbed Ethan by the collar. "She went with Daniel. I checked the school surveillance, she was dragging her suitcase and left with Daniel." Evan's voice trembled more and more violently as he gripped Ethan's collar tighter, almost choking him. "Did you hear me? She left with Daniel. Do you not know what Daniel is going to do? Don't you understand?" Breathing was labored, yet Ethan forgot to move. After the immense fear and despair, what remained was an endless, abyss-like confusion. How could he not know what Daniel had gone to do? The list of participants in the 10-year confidential medical research, Ethan, as an associate professor and academic advisor at the institute. It was personally reviewed and confirmed by him and a group of senior colleagues and peers at the institute. Daniel was on that list. And days ago, as early as last Saturday, the research officially began. Where Daniel went goes without saying. Ethan staggered to his feet, devastated as he walked toward the door. "I'll go look for her, bring her home. It's Thanksgiving tomorrow, she's always stayed home for the holidays every year." Evan trembled, his voice full of despair. "Why must you listen to Tiffany and insist on going to Norway? We agreed on Mo. Even Anna had agreed to Mo. If we had, maybe she wouldn't have wanted to leave." Ethan remained silent. He walked to the bedroom door, Evan's agonized cries echoing behind him. "Stop pretending. Ethan, how long has it been since you last cared for Anna?" Ethan halted his steps. He felt his movements become unbearably sluggish, taking a long moment before he slowly turned around, his eyes empty as he looked at Evan. "And what about you? Have you cared for her?" Evan's face, filled with rage and grief, froze in an instant. Then, gradually, he crouched down, covering his face as his shoulders trembled. "They are all the same. None are innocent, and none can escape blame. The northern city has been struck by heavy snowfall for several consecutive days. In the dead of night, thick layers of snow blanket the streets." Ethan didn't even remember to put on his coat as he left home to find Professor Richard again. Professor Richard spoke with a tone of helplessness. "It's really not that I don't want to tell you. This confidential research, apart from those involved. No one else will know the specific location and progress of the research. I only escorted Anna and the others to Nan City, had one last meal with them. After they departed for the research institute, I was no longer authorized to follow. The institute's exact location most likely isn't in the southern city either." Ethan murmured in a dazed whisper, "There must be a way. Let me think. I'll find a way. We'll locate it eventually." Professor Richard sighed softly. "My apologies for speaking out of turn. Your parents' accident happened precisely because their research progress was leaked. The lack of confidentiality measures gave criminals an opportunity to strike. This time, no outsider will be able to find them before the research is concluded." Ethan sounded as if he'd lost his soul, stubbornly insisting, "I will find a way." Professor Richard couldn't help warning him, making a big show of searching for Anna might very well put her in danger. "Ethan, don't forget about your parents. If you truly care about Anna, respect her choice. Ethan's pupils suddenly trembled. The heavy snow in the dead of night had frozen the vast northern city into a silver-white wonderland. Seemingly, it had completely frozen him along with it. He stood rooted to the spot, unable to even lift a fingertip. Anna was gone. He couldn't even bring himself to try and look for her anymore. Professor Richard turned around, entered the front yard, and closed the door. In the freezing snowy wilderness, only Ethan remained at last. No, there was one more. He turned back and saw Evan standing under a tree behind him. Eyes met, and beneath the cold street lights, within each other's gazes, they saw the same utterly shattered hope. Ethan suddenly remembered, many, many years ago. There had been a heavy snow like this in North City. When their parents passed away suddenly, 12-year-old Anna cried almost to the point of suffocation in the midst of that snowstorm. Back then, he held her and said, "As long as your brother is here, Anna will always have a home." It seems he broke his promise. Ethan didn't dare to go home anymore. He didn't even know where to go. He drove aimlessly through the streets until, somehow, he ended up at the orphanage in the suburbs. It suddenly occurred to him, that was when he and Anna began to drift apart and argue. It all started from when he brought Tiffany back from the orphanage. If time could return to that moment, if he had never brought Tiffany back, what would things be like now? His thoughts were a chaotic mess. Until suddenly, under the moonlight and streetlights, he caught sight of two figures standing outside the orphanage gate. One tall, one short. Even in such dim light, Ethan could easily recognize the smaller one. It was Tiffany. He was in a daze, driving over without even turning on the headlights. So those two people didn't notice his approach. As if pulled by an invisible force, Ethan stopped the car and walked over silently. He had actually gotten close enough that perhaps just a glance from them would reveal his presence in the dim darkness. Yet they were clearly engrossed in their conversation, voices tinged with argument, neither sparing a glance elsewhere. Ethan heard for the first time that Tiffany, only 11 years old, could have such a sinister tone. "Do you think they would still believe you if you went and said I'm not that Tiffany again? Why should I listen to you? Why should I come back just because I got better? They've raised me for 4 years and already treat me as their own younger sister. They don't even care about Anna anymore." "That bitch Anna called last week," I answered. I could tell from her tone. "She's not coming back. From now on, I'm their only sister, their only one. So what if she's blood related? Over these years, I've broken so many of her things, yet her 2 brothers always defended me. I pretended to be pushed by her. That fool still tried to grab me. Falling and getting hurt yourself, then getting slapped, serves you right. She wanted to go to Mo, but I insisted on Norway, and guess what, they took me to Norway instead. Everything will belong to me from now on, all of it will be mine alone." Perhaps she felt these were truly things too splendid not to boast about. As Tiffany spoke, her eyes brimmed with the triumph and ecstasy of victory. Her face bore a twisted, sinister expression that sharply contrasted with her age. Their quarreling voices continued endlessly. Ethan wanted to rush forward, to tear them apart, to make them suffer 1,000 cuts. But he couldn't move. Even if he killed those before him, would his Anna ever return? Could the outcome still be changed? No more, no more. It's too late, it's already too late. Countless images flashed through my mind like a frantic slideshow. The first time Anna told Tiffany to get out, desperately trying to explain that she was an imposter. The first time Anna's photo frame was smashed, the first time she cried out in heartbroken sobs. Anna covered her face for the first time, swallowing her tears in silence at her most wronged and helpless moment. Anna fell down the stairs for the first time. The first slap he ever delivered. Every bit, every drop, paved the road for her departure. Never had Ethan realized until this moment, he had lost Anna. She was gone, never to return. Ethan didn't know how he made it back home. Upon entering, he saw Evan slumped on the sofa. The nanny sat across from Evan with an indifferent expression. "It's not that I'm only revealing the truth now. Which matter has the young lady ever not told the truth about? Evan stared blankly at her, his eyes devoid of any light. He must have heard the same things as Ethan. The nanny's voice was filled with sorrow. I've taken care of the young lady for many years. I just believe that, though she might have occasionally been willful and mischievous, she always knew right from wrong. When she shouldn't lie, she would never lie. They used to believe the same way. So why did they stop trusting Anna after Tiffany arrived? Evan stood up, staggering as he climbed the stairs. Ethan followed him, watching as he entered the bedroom, opened the suitcase, and took out a bright red scarf. Evan muttered to himself, as if talking to no one, I promised her. When she comes back, I should give it to her. Ethan said in a hoarse voice, she's not coming back. Evan's lips trembled, and finally, unable to hold back any longer, he shed tears for the first time. Tears silently soaked into the scarf as his voice trembled until it finally became inaudible. Yes, she won't come back. 12 years had passed when I left the research institute. The drug development achieved complete success, with the targeted medication for heart failure receiving approval for low-cost market release. On the day of the press conference, I attended alongside my fellow researchers and mentors. Many heart failure patients and their families spontaneously came to the venue, emotionally moved to tears while expressing their gratitude. That day happened to be Thanksgiving, the anniversary of my parents' sacrifice in the line of duty. Time seemed to rewrite their fate as if it were starting over. Suddenly, I remembered that night many years ago when my mother held me gently and said, "Speed up the progress. Then those patients can afford the medicine by Thanksgiving and have a good holiday." Back then, I didn't fully understand many things. Nor could I comprehend the fiery passion and mistiness in my mother's eyes. She said softly, too many patients in this world choose to give up their lives because of poverty and expensive medication. For every additional dollar reduced in drug prices, perhaps one more patient may find the hope to live on. Anna, this is also Mom and Dad's wish. They passed away abruptly and hastily, leaving behind unfulfilled hopes. And now, I have finally written the final chapter for them. Can they finally rest in peace in the underworld? I accepted the flowers from the patient and the interviews from the swarming journalists. The crowd was bustling, and suddenly, my gaze collided with a familiar pair of eyes. Across the surging sea of people, I abruptly spotted Ethan in the distance, along with Evan who had come with him. 12 years had passed since we last met, and they had begun to age, just like me. Calculating, they were both now in their 40s. Fine wrinkles had formed around Evan's eyes, his face bearing the marks of weariness and the toll of time. And Ethan, just 42 years old, already had streaks of gray at his temples. As our gazes met, for a brief moment, it felt like an eternity had passed between us. The eldest brother who skipped class to attend my parent-teacher meeting, the second brother who stood on a stool to cook and make soup for me. The mischievous and playful Anna in her childhood. Now, we have all begun to grow old. They forced a smile, wanting to laugh, yet appeared as though they might cry. After 12 years apart, they watched me intently from afar. Yet ultimately, not a single step was taken toward me. I smiled back at them, my heart finally at peace. 12 years had not simply worn away resentment and hatred. Rather, they had allowed me to truly let go. As the press conference ended, I left with my colleagues and mentors. Suddenly, from behind, came a man's hoarse and urgent voice, "Anna. Anna. How long has it been since anyone called me Anna? I can't remember." The rest of the group, seeing the situation, left first. Daniel gently patted my shoulder, "Anna, I'll wait for you outside." I nodded. Turning around, I saw Ethan and Evan hurrying toward me in a panicked rush. Stopping at a distance of 2 steps, they seemed afraid to come any closer and halted in their tracks. I looked at them, remaining silent for a long time. Until Ethan spoke hoarsely, "How have you been all these years?" I replied softly, "I've been fine." Evan tried hard to restrain himself, but a tremendous pain and regret still surfaced in his eyes. "We all know about Tiffany now. Anna, it's your brother." "I'm sorry." my heart no longer stirred. I only said calmly, "It's okay, it's all in the past." Ethan's face twitched slightly. After a long pause, he cautiously asked again, "Could we still have a meal together?" I shook my head. "No, let's not." The hope in his eyes instantly dimmed. Without lingering any longer, I turned and walked away. Behind me, Ethan's hoarse voice called out once more, "I'm sorry." My steps faltered slightly. In the end, I walked out of the venue and didn't look back. I went back to North City and met my mentor, Professor Richard. 12 years later, his hair had turned completely white. I heard him speak of Ethan and Evan's breakdown and remorse during the 12 years I was away. Evan collapsed into despair and was rushed to the emergency room dozens of times due to alcohol abuse. Ethan had participated in numerous medical experiments and research studies at the academy during his years of grief. Consecutive all-nighters and overwork caused his health to steadily decline. Tiffany was driven out of the house. Accustomed to a lavish lifestyle, she refused to return to the orphanage no matter what. Later, she fell in with a gang of ruffians, went motorcycle racing at their urging, and suffered a horrific crash. She barely survived but ended up with a broken leg and brain damage. Now we don't even know where he's wandered off to, reduced to a feeble-minded vagrant. Dead or alive, no one knows for certain anymore. Hearing all this, in the end, all that remains within me is stillness. By the end, Professor Richard sighed softly. They did come to regret it. All these years, they've carried that remorse deeply. Anna, have you ever considered? I softly interrupted my mentor's words, I don't want to think about it anymore. For me, it's all in the past. For the rest of my life, I will continue to dedicate myself to pharmaceutical research. As for my 2 brothers, I don't hate them, but I have no desire to look back either. At the age of 37, I married Daniel. Due to our older age, Daniel didn't want me to risk childbirth, so we adopted a newborn daughter. On my daughter's 3rd birthday, I hosted a party for her. As the celebration ended, I saw off the last few guests. Just as I was about to go back inside, I noticed Ethan and Evan standing in the shadows under a distant tree. This year, I turned 40, while they were nearing 50. Ethan was seated in a wheelchair, which surprised me, making me take a second look. They must have been standing there for a long time, yet didn't dare to enter. Noticing my gaze, their eyes lit up with joy. Evan immediately pushed the wheelchair and hurried toward me. Only then did I notice they were holding something in their hands. Evan carefully handed over a gift box. "This is a gift for your daughter. I hope she likes it." There was an unmasked humility and unease in his voice. After a long hesitation, I finally reached out and took it. Ethan's eyes brightened, and he immediately handed over the bouquet in his hands. "It's been so long, I forgot to congratulate you." I didn't know what he was referring to. Was it the successful completion of my decade-long drug research, my recent marriage, or my daughter? But I didn't ask, merely reaching out to take it with a gentle yet distant voice, "Thank you." Evan was still holding a gift bag in his hand. Trembling, he pulled out a bright red scarf. When offering it to me, he couldn't bring himself to look at me again. "I'm sorry. I owed you this for so long." Suddenly, I remembered, back in the dimly lit bedroom, Evan staying up late by the window, knitting the scarf for me. Just because, at that time, I saw a classmate showing off the scarf her mother had knitted for her. My mom couldn't spare the time, and Ethan was too carefree to be bothered with such delicate handiwork. Evan secretly sought out the admirer who gave him the scarf and asked them to teach him how to knit one. To me, it was never just a scarf. And now, it isn't something that can be compensated for with a scarf. But I just smiled and still didn't refuse. In the end, my hands were so full I could barely hold everything. They finally left. I turned back and entered the house, walked to the front yard gate, bent down, and placed everything I was holding outside the door. My brothers had never given me so many things at once before. But this time I didn't want them. As I set the things down, I inadvertently turned back. She saw Ethan and Evan not far away, who stopped in their tracks and looked over. They noticed the items discarded on the ground, then, similarly, turned their gaze away with sorrow and haste. That night, I received a call from the hospital. I was told Ethan was on the verge of death and asked if I wanted to see him one last time. In the end, I rushed to the hospital. Over all these years, Ethan had also devoted himself to medical research, giving it his all. As a mentor and also a researcher. Now under 50, my body is already plagued by numerous ailments. I entered the ward and sat by his side. Suddenly remembering, it was my daughter's birthday banquet yesterday. He came to see me in a wheelchair, forcing himself to stay, likely for our final farewell. Evan sat across from me, his expression sorrowful. A man nearing 50, yet he covered his face, weeping uncontrollably. I looked at Ethan's body, covered with tubes, the monitoring devices beeping incessantly. The oxygen mask covered his mouth and nose, and he struggled to open his mouth. I couldn't hear his voice. Despite decades of siblings, I easily recognized his lip movements. He was calling me, repeatedly, urgent but weak. Anna, Anna. I remembered that heavy snowfall again, and that Ethan less than 20 years old who held me tightly. With your brother here, Anna will always have a home. Thinking back on past years, it feels like a long dream. His face turned ashen, then his breathing became more and more labored. When he reached out to touch me, it must have taken every last ounce of his strength. In the end, I reached out and gently held his hand. Speaking softly once more, "Hey, when you get there, get some good rest too." I saw the tear at the corner of his eye suddenly fall. As if there were 1,000 things to say, yet in the end, only those 2 words were repeated countless times. Anna, Anna. I watched as he closed his eyes. The heart rate monitor slowly drew a long, endless flat line. Leaving the hospital, it was snowing heavily again. Daniel was waiting outside and draped his coat over me when I came out. As I was about to get into the car, I felt an inexplicable pull and turned around to see Evan standing behind me. His hair had begun to gray as well, with weariness etched in his features. Snowflakes drifted down, settling on his hair and shoulders. Through the howling snow, I said to him, "Take good care of yourself from now on." Tears that had just stopped welled up again, reddening his eyes in an instant. Opening my mouth, countless words ultimately condensed into just one sentence, "You too." I opened the car door and got in. As the car drove away, the lonely, slightly hunched figure behind gradually disappeared from sight. Snowflakes fell on the car window, blurring my vision. In my dazed state, I saw that home once again. Amidst heavy snowfall, our family of 5 gathered around a hot pot for a meal. Mother brought cups while father poured the wine. We gathered around the dining table, eating steaming hot pot. In the rising steam, I seemed to see my parents sitting across from us again, raising their glasses with a smile. Have the New Year's Eve dinner, I softly echoed the blessing I'd heard since childhood, may every year hence be filled with reunion and joy. Ethan and Evan's eyes reddened simultaneously, nodding firmly in unison, "We will." Every Thanksgiving, the old house is bustling with excitement. Daniel would bring our adopted daughter along, and the little girl would sweetly call them Uncle Ethan and Uncle Evan, pestering Ethan for bedtime stories and begging Evan for new scarves. Ethan eventually recovered his health, though he still coughs occasionally, but he always asks me a month in advance what I'd like to eat. Evan's cooking skills have improved tremendously, he even learned to make strawberry-filled rice balls, calling them Anna's special flavor. We went to Norway together to see the aurora. Not with regrets, but with fulfillment. That night, the sky unfurled a vast green curtain of light, like fireworks specially lit by the heavens for our family. Our daughter screamed and ran through the snow, Daniel held my shoulder, while Ethan and Evan stood behind us, wrapped in matching red scarves, their eyes shining like children's. "Anna," Ethan said softly, "thank you, for coming back." Evan gently patted my head, just as tenderly as when we were kids, "Welcome home." I looked up at the aurora and suddenly understood. Home was never meant to be perfect, but rather the people who would drop everything to wait for your return after you left. And I had finally come back to them completely. The luckiest thing in this life is that I was once deeply loved by them, and after being lost, was gently found again by them for the rest of their days. From now on, no matter how heavy the storm, we'll always be under the same roof. Together in joy, year after year.